Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar from the Institution of Mechanical Engineers on how environmental regulation is helping us better prepare for a rapidly changing climate and future weather extremes. My name is Dr. Tim Fox, and I'll be chairing this event today. The webinar builds on the institution's report, Adapting Industry to Withstand Rising Temperatures and Future Heat Waves, which we published earlier this year, and I'm delighted to be joined by Mike Nicholas and Spence Seaman, both from the Environment Agency, and who are our speakers for today. Biographies for both Mike and Spence can be found on the webpage for this event on the institution's website, so on the page that you use to register for this event. Following the presentation, I'll be moderating a Q&A discussion session with Mike and Spence, and in this regard, I encourage you to use the Q&A function to post your questions during the event. So now, without further ado, over to Spence to begin what proves to be an interesting, informative and useful presentation. Spence, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon. So as Tim has very kindly introduced me, Spence Seaman, I work across the Environment Agency's regulated industry function within head office, and I support our work to deliver our climate change ambition, both to support the UK net zero journey for those that we regulate, but also importantly, the adaptation support that we've been working on and what we're going to be talking about with my colleague today, Mike Nicholas. So just by way of background, the industries that we regulate it's a very broad range, from nuclear power stations right through to small waste operations through to intensive farms. So it's a broad spectrum of activities that we regulate here at the Environment Agency. And so we're very keen to make sure whatever approach we take to supporting those we regulate to be more resilient to climate change, both chronic and acute impacts, that it's proportionate. And I think that will be a theme, hopefully comes across through both myself and Mike's slides as we go through. So what I'm going to run through today for you is, first of all, some background as to and what we had previously under our approach, which is under the environmental permitting regime, a review of why we needed to make some changes to the previous approach, and then really start to home in on, well, what does that revised approach look like? And importantly, talk about next steps. And then I'll hand over the floor to Mike, who's going to give some much more detailed kind of look at the sort of climate impacts that industry has been experiencing in the last few years. So where did all this come from? Well, we set out our stall back in October 2021 when we published our third adaptation report, which was titled Living Better with a Changing Climate. And this is a duty that's placed on the likes of the Environment Agency to report under the Climate Change Act of 2008. And we were determined, I think, to make quite an impact with our third adaptation report. And I would tend to think it did so, not least of which was helped by our then chairman, Chair Emma Howard-Boyd, really kind of coming up with some headline grabbing sort of narrative to sit behind our third report, and coined the phrase adapt or die. And maybe not surprisingly, that really helped land our messages. So it definitely did have quite an impact and received good feedback from a very broad spectrum of stakeholders. And I think within our third adaptation report, we were really trying to make two really key messages, that business as usual is just not sustainable any longer, and we need to review and revise our approaches and those that we regulate, and that fundamentally we're here to help. We are, a knowledgeable organisation when it comes to climate change and the impacts thereof. And so we are on a journey together, and fundamentally we're here to help industry on that journey. So, some of the key messages that we really pointed to is that the climate change is exacerbating the environmental risks that from those that we regulate. So that's a key theme that runs throughout, and really it was the starting point, I guess, for what has come next within the next couple of years. We've really done a fundamental review of our requirements under the environmental permitting regime and the requirements to consider adaptation throughout. So just by way of a very quick recap, I'm sure nobody really needs this, but just as a reminder, today we're very much talking about adaptation. It's often termed two sides of the same coin alongside mitigation and the journey to net zero. But as an organisation, what we're really trying to promote here is that we see a resilient transition to net zero. There is precious little point getting to net zero if it's not a resilient journey and endpoint. So adaptation and mitigation go absolutely hand in hand. And I think as that diagram kind of helps illustrate, there is many overlaps, and you simply cannot do one without the other. And certainly with it, adaptation and indeed net zero, we're really promoting the concept of system thinking and how vital that is when operators are looking at investment decisions for them to reach their net zero targets. Then they must ensure that those investment decisions are going to be resilient to climate change, both in the short, the medium and the long term. And I think one of the fundamental messages here is that we need operators, those we regulate, to consider both chronic climate impacts as well as those acute changes, those extreme weather events perhaps that many of us can remember from just last year and earlier. But those two aspects are fundamental in our thinking and support package that we've been working on ever since. So what have we done? Well, fundamentally, we have gone back to our guidance under the environmental permitting regime. This is all hosted on gov.uk, and you'll see some links there on the slide. We went back to our guidance on developing a management system. That's really the cornerstone for all of this work. And so in August last year, we republished our management system guidance, and it provides a much greater focus on the need to consider climate change adaptation through all of sites' operations and planning. That guidance and the supporting guidance is, as I say, available on gov.uk. And we also took the opportunity to have a further look at something that we had published previously, which were and are industry example risk assessments. So it was a kind of package that I'll go through in a bit more detail in a second. But really, we were really keen to make sure that, to make the full impact from this change, we needed to deliver a support package to those that we regulate. So it wasn't a question of revising some guidance, put it out there, pointing people to it and hoping for the best. We were very, very aware that behind it, you really would need a whole package, both internally for our own staff, but also importantly externally, so that people can really start to make the progress that's needed to deliver good quality adaptation planning. So within our work, we were very clear at the outset that we needed to give some clear and concise messages in terms of what our expectations were for those that we regulate. The graph there gives some illustrations of the uncertainty, which is a significant complication. Clearly, when any operator is looking to make investment decisions, they want as much, and their financial backers want as much certainty as possible in terms of those decision making points. And so uncertainty is a recognised problem throughout adaptation. And I think what we were trying to get across, and I think successfully, I would hope, is the fact that we can give some key messages and some key kind of criteria to operators we regulate, rather than getting completely bogged down in conversations about, well, which representative concentration pathway should I be following to the nth degree. Well, let's give some much clearer and concise messages. So that's really where, and again, working with others in, say, the Met Office and those in the financial world, we've come up with some very clear messages that we are requiring operators to assess the risks out to 2100 of a 4-degree rise, and importantly, plan to manage the risks of an associated 2-degree rise by 2050. And within that, another key message is that absolutely you need to avoid the risk of lock-in. There's no point making those investment decisions and having a good plan that indicates when the critical points are for those investment decisions, if you're then going to put in investment which cannot be improved upon at a later date. Avoiding lock-in is all about avoiding the early redundancy of investment decisions in the face of climate change. So lock-in is quite a significant risk, and we really wanted to help operators to be better sighted on that risk. So those 3 bullets there are really the building block, if you like, of our revised approach. And just by way of background, we do regulate, as I said earlier, it's a vast range of operators that fall within the scope of the environmental permitting regime, around 12,000 permitted sites. But we've also worked from the outset with colleagues in local authorities, so that this can also and will also ultimately apply to local authority regulated sites, of which within England there's approximately 400 to 500, and that's really the slightly smaller processes and a couple of precise examples in small incinerators, for example. So it's a quite a broad look at the sectors that we regulate. So just turning to, well, what have we actually done? I've already talked and mentioned the update to the management system guidance, and when we republished that last year, we also were very conscious that we needed to give clarity to operators as to what's expected by when, and so we've made some further amendments so that it's very clear our expectation in this area is for all permitted sites within scope of the requirement to have at least completed a risk assessment by April 24. So that's a key message, I think, that I'd like to help get across today. That is a date that we've set within the management system guidance that as a minimum we would expect to see operators having completed a risk assessment by April next year. And really our approach, for those that are kind of wondering the backstory here, was built on some pilots that we carried out jointly with our colleagues in Scotland at SEPA and with a third-party consultancy. And we were really looking to build from the learning, and some of the key messages that had come out of that were really that, people, operators, environmental managers on the ground absolutely recognise the need to be doing something in this space, but frankly weren't always sure where to start and what was really being required. And then on top of that, you had the lack of senior management buy-in to the need to do more on adaptation. So our process has been very much built on some pilots that we did, really starting to look at, well, if a site were to embrace the ISO standard 14,090, then what would they need to do? What would they need to have in place to make that a successful transition to good adaptation planning? So it really builds on those pilots. As I mentioned earlier, we've updated those sector-specific risk assessments. There's 15 of them. If you take a look at the link there, there's 15 across the range of sectors that I've talked about. and they have been well received. They were well received previously under our previous approach, but what we were keen to do here is really update them fresh from the unfortunate events of last year, the extreme weather, whether it was the 3 storms in February or the summer heat waves and subsequent droughts. Then there was a lot, sadly, there was a lot of learning from last year. So we were very keen to capture that within the updated risk assessment. So again, those have been republished in April this year, and I would encourage anybody who's sort of embarking on this journey to take a look at a couple of relevant examples for your sector. And then to support all of that, we've developed supporting guidance. So you've got the management system guidance that kind of tells you what the end point is, but the supporting guidance is really what's needed to help you on that journey. And that's unashamedly focused or aligned with the ISO 14090. It's a kind of a theme that runs through our work, because we felt right from the outset that that standard is very proportionate and appropriate for the vast majority of sites that we regulate. And then lastly, externally, we've produced a good practice guidance template, and that was published again last year. The idea here is the likes of organizations like IMechE and trade associations can pick up that guidance template as a starting point, and then finesse it, put in relevant case studies for their sectors, and publish their own guidance to support their own members who may not have already been grappling with the challenges of good adaptation planning. And then the very last piece here is, all of that is not going to be making the impact unless our own staff are capable and we have the capacity to really regulate on adaptation. So we've developed, again, jointly with SEPA, a training package which has various modules to really help our regulatory officers understand what good adaptation planning is all about, and a real appreciation of our approach in this space. So what does it look like? Well, I think I would be very keen to stress, I mentioned it perhaps at the start, but that everybody is at a different starting point. I think some of the feedback from our pilots indicated that people and corporates and companies are all in different starting points, and we need to recognize that in our approach. I think there's a constant challenge throughout in terms of the resources and the capability in this area. Climate change adaptation planning can become complex very quickly, and there is a risk that people will put it in the too difficult pile. So there's always a challenge around the capability that's available within companies and indeed externally to support you in this journey. So that's partly why, again, we're pointing to the use of the ISO standard. Clearly, our role as regulator, we're going to be supportive of national critical infrastructure. There's an absolutely critical part for us to play there. But again, we're being proportionate. We're trying to recognize at the outset that the risk assessments and the planning are all going to be contingent on the level of complexity and the hazards that a site poses. And then lastly, and currently running at the moment, we've been developed a questionnaire which is really aimed at helping obtain even better sort of view of how sectors are feeling. Are they feeling really well prepared for climate change, or are they thinking, crikey, I know I need to be getting on with it, but I really don't know where to begin. So that questionnaire is live at the moment. It's voluntary, but we are hoping that the responses will help us to further shape our ongoing support over the next couple of years to really embed our expectation here in terms of our revised approach. And I won't go into detail today, but if anybody does want to catch me afterwards, then drop me a line, or there's an email address there, adaptation EPR at the Environment Agency, for any queries either about the questionnaire or indeed about the general approach and the requirement for a risk assessment by next April. So I will now hand over to my colleague, Mike Nicholas. And Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Spence. We'll call it serendipity, but I was asked to talk about climate impacts, and just last week the Environment Agency published its revised climate impacts tool. Spence has already mentioned our adaptation report. The climate impacts tool is the guidance that we use internally so that we can all have consistent conversations about the present day and future impacts. And this time round, we have added to the scientific evidence basis and added a part 2 narrative section, which discusses broadly many cascading and systemic risks associated with climate change. And the chart on the right shows the 4 key scenarios that we use when we start our climate journeys, when we initially screen for risks for any strategy, policy, or individual decisions, local decisions on projects, and indeed when we're having discussions external to the agency. So our first scenario is present day, on the basis that the climate has already changed. And on that note, I do like to keep my presentations up to date. And if anyone has been following the news in the last few days, I have personally suffered climate impacts in that I live in Surrey, and Storm Ciarán has disrupted my water supply by taking out the local water treatment works. I don't know of the root causes, but I guess a silver lining to that cloud is that my local MP is also our Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. So he is now well aware of the issues surrounding climate impacts, that as we move into the future, extreme weather can only get more severe and more extreme, and there is a desperate need for adaptation finance to be deployed to enable resilient infrastructure. As we look to the future, we talk a lot about the net zero transition by 2050, and we need to remain resilient in our decisions that meet that challenge. By 2050, we are looking most likely at a 2 degrees C rise from pre-industrial levels. That 2 degrees is a global temperature rise. From then on in, there is a divergence of future possibilities, future scenarios, and they're depicted by the different coloured lines fanning out, which we call pathways. The more successful we are globally at mitigating the release of carbon dioxide, limiting the release of greenhouse gases, the lower the temperature rise will be in the long term. If we're not successful, we could be looking at a 4 degrees C rise by the end of the century, with continued increases beyond. So this gives us the 4 different scenarios we use: present day, mid-century, managed transition as the third scenario, which would be arriving at 2 degrees C by 2100, and runaway change, plus 4 degrees by 2100. Now on the next slide, we've put together a selection of different physical impacts which we will see at a national level in England as a result of those different possible futures. So with present day benchmark, and incidentally, we had to increase the temperatures in the present day benchmark from the last version. We're consistently seeing increasing temperatures and other impacts. We could then be looking at warmer and drier summers. So summer temperatures could locally in England exceed plus 6 degrees C rise from the industrial levels. And it's interesting to note here the difference in the top right box the difference between a mid-century +2 and an end-of-century +2. So both the same temperature, but the additional 50 years shows that sea level rise is an impact which is slow to respond. And there is a large degree of sea level rise which is already baked in. You can't readily put the brakes on, as it were. Sea levels very dependent on the point in time at which you're referring to. Summer hot days. It's getting hotter more often, as we saw last year. Chance of seeing 40 degrees C exceeded in the UK, whilst at the moment that sits around once a century. By 2100, if we're unsuccessful with mitigation, we could be seeing that once every 3 years. And even an optimistic scenario is once every 15 years. And rainfall intensity increasing in both summer and winter, which combined with drier summers overall means that rivers are going to see much more extremes of flows, higher peak river flows and smaller, lower low flows. So again, much more extremes. Now the next slide shows how those physical impacts of weather might then cascade and cause knock-on physical impacts or wider cascading systemic impacts. Top right, intense rainfall. We, the Environment Agency, are impacted by that. We need to keep our staff, our employees safe, and intense rainfall can pose risks to staff, especially when working outside or travelling. Of course, we're a Category 1 responder, along with other emergency services, and storms and floods also impact emergency responder resources and the ability to access and attend incidents. Throughout this slide, you can see a plethora of cascading impacts that influence infrastructure, influence the ecosystems within which they operate, and there can be some quite complex feedback loops and interactions between human and natural systems, with not just linear cascading impacts, but a diverse range of impacts spreading and cascading throughout different parts of the system. And that can really provide a challenge when you have an extreme weather event or other climate impact. We see just today that our infrastructure, our ways of living have been designed for the weather, for the climate of the past. Climate impacts are increasing. They are becoming more frequent and more severe, and we need to act now to manage the risks. So let's take a closer look at some of the effects that these natural hazards can pose on the built environment, industry in particular. So the next slide shows the first sort of range of physical impacts: high temperature and prolonged dry weather, as we experienced in 2022 in the UK. And all of these bullet points reflect failings within one or more of the sites that we regulate, causing impacts. Sites found that there were insufficient process cooling, and particularly where ambient air was being used as a coolant. Process equipment overheating and failing. Not directly regulated by us, the telecom sector had data centers which needed to be shut down because the ambient temperature exceeded the design criteria and they were at risk of overheating. And there was an increased fire risk, as evidenced by the newsreel pictures of fires burning all over the country, the fire and rescue services calling multiple simultaneous major incidents, plus the direct impact on workforce, the human factors side of operating a site. And the heat exacerbated, which was an ongoing period of prolonged dry weather and drought. And again, lack of water can have direct impact on industrial cooling systems, fire water availability, and at the same time increases the vulnerability of receptors, receptors being stressed and more vulnerable to the impacts of incidents. And the next slide visually captures some of the cascading impacts. High temperatures cause rail networks to buckle. If some industrial sites are large enough to have their own internal rail systems, and that can cause direct disruption within the installation. Here we can see an attempt to keep rails cool by painting them white. It's not just those sites which have rail systems directly within them. If you're operating a site which relies on supplies via rail networks, and particularly if it's a just-in-time setup, then any disruption to transport infrastructure can cause knock-on cascading impacts to your operations. And there was increased fire risk, and indeed we saw a fire at a chemicals site, Middlewich, which was just one of many impacting around the country. The flip side of hot weather is shown on the next slide. Flooding, high winds and storms, as we've experienced in the last few weeks, and combined with sea level rise, pose multiple threats, whether that's floating of vessels, loss of power utilities, compromising drainage, secondary and tertiary containment, so that if there is a failure, there will be no backup systems to contain loss of primary containment, but also hampering emergency response, either because the responders are already tied up elsewhere, protecting people and property, or because of direct access or egress issues. So the next slide graphically shows the risks to one coma establishment, and this was during one of the storm surges, East Coast surges, where water overtopped the defences from an estuary and flooded into a coma storage site. Fortunately, on this occasion, you can see that the tanks are sat within a bund, and whilst bunds are not normally designed to hold liquids out, they're normally designed to withstand the forces of liquids inside the bund. On this occasion, the bund kept the tanks dry. The tanks did not float. And also on this occasion, the operators who were in the control room to the right remained safe. Now that could have been a very different story, and there is a tragic tale of a fuel farm in Egypt, Dronka, which flooded, and in that case there was a loss of containment and fuel was carried out of the fuel farm and through a town. The fuel was ignited by lightning and over 400 people died because of it. So again, very sober to think that climate impacts are increasing and becoming more severe, posing challenges to our infrastructure more frequently. And the next slide reminds us that we can still see extreme winter impacts, heavy snowfall, and incidentally, whilst winter temperatures are rising, they will not rise enough to stop the UK seeing heavy snowfall. And in fact, with increased moisture in the air, some are starting to think that maybe we could see even heavier snowfall. And there were instances across Scotland one year where snow loading caused the collapse of many whiskey bond warehouse roofs. So weight on structures is a problem. Again, loss of power, utilities control, these cascading systemic impacts are very common in the winter, as are access restrictions and subsequent flooding, freeze thaw. Aside from snowfall, ice and prolonged cold can also impact either direct impact on instruments, causation of metal fatigue, other equipment damage, freezing of whatever is contained within the process systems, especially if there are dead legs where you have no flow. In that case, it might not be recognised that there has been a liquid freeze, a failure of the system, and it can then subsequently thaw and leak. The next slide. We all, I think, have heard about the story of the Titanic. It hit an iceberg, didn't it? Well, more recently, metallurgists have been thinking that there might have been some baked-in latent defects insofar as that the steel of the hull of the Titanic is believed to have been much more brittle than present-day steels. And moreover, as she sailed through the ice field, the cold temperatures would have potentially made it more brittle, such that when she did hit the iceberg, it was much more likely that the hull would fracture as opposed to dent. And that is something quite common that we see in industrial accidents that are triggered by natural hazards or narthex. The fact that there might be latent defects lurking right back at the design phase, which have been then subsequently exposed by climate impacts and extreme weather. Next slide, please. So to bring it back to what the Environment Agency is championing, we're championing creating a net zero nation resilient to climate change. Fortunately, the wind turbine pictured on the left, struck by lightning, did not go up in flames, although many have. Unfortunately, the anaerobic digestion site in the picture on the bottom right did burn when it was struck by lightning. And very recent research from the Met Office, as it has been improving the resolution of storm and lightning modelling, suggests that certain areas of Europe, including the UK, are set to see more frequent lightning strikes as we progress into the future. So we need to make choices to ensure that whatever infrastructure we install is resilient to the future impacts. Next slide, please. Now, Spencer's already alluded, there is a lot of available guidance to help operators become more resilient. There is a series of international and British standards, ISO 14090 and 91, which talk about management and risk assessment for adaptation, and also a British standard, BS 8631, which talks about a decision approach called adaptation pathways. And they're all authored, designed to be embedded into the standard Plan, Do, Check, Act approach, management system approach. Those standards are supported by other guidance. So the IMechE guidance is very good, rising seas, and also adapting industry to withstand rising temperatures and future heat waves. There is much more available, but the next slide shows quite a good starting point to actually get to grips with this. And I'd recommend that whether or not you fall within the environmental permitting regime, you take a look at this guidance, because it will take you through in a stepwise fashion how climate adaptation can be embedded into management systems, from risk assessment through adaptation planning into monitoring and evaluation and governance aspects. Yeah, it's a very good read. Next slide, please. So to conclude, the climate is changing and things are moving at pace and scale. We, the Environment Agency, are championing a net zero transition which is resilient to climate change, but we don't have all the answers. With industry and regulator collaboration, we will succeed in creating a net zero nation that is resilient. And we need to remember we're all in this together. We need to continually share our experiences and promote the best practices. Thank you. Next slide will give us some space for questions. And for those who haven't seen it before, on the left is a summary of the Environment Agency's climate ambition, centred around the creation of a net zero nation resilient to climate change. Thank you. Over to you, to Tim.
Thank you very much, Mike and Spence. That was an excellent presentation, and I'm sure has stimulated a lot of interest in the audience. Quite a lot of information shared there, and I must admit, I really admire the work you're doing at the Environment Agency in this area. It's absolutely essential, and I'm using the regulatory permitting route is a very good way to start businesses thinking about these issues. One question I had on that, actually, just you touched on it a little bit towards the very end there, Mike, but you know, what you've done is a huge amount of work and a huge amount of sort of integrating ISO 1490 and other information into this management system approach. How can we take what you've done and apply it beyond the regulated industries? I mean, clearly a huge amount of what you've done would be highly relevant and useful to businesses more broadly that are unregulated, and sort of beyond those 12,000 sites and the 400 or 500 that the local authorities look after the permissions for. Are there plans within the Environment Agency to roll this out or make raise awareness of this, and besides you mentioning it in sort of podcasts, webinars like the one we just are doing?
Yeah, in terms of the standards, they are promoting themselves by being basically so good, being so useful and so helpful. It's been a journey over the past 10 years to get to the point of recommending their use, right back to the Climate Ready service, which the Environment Agency ran, and indeed the experience of internally of our flood, coastal erosion risk management colleagues, because we have been responsible for taxpayers' money to invest, maintain the resilience of flood infrastructure. And our experience, combined with the experience of others over the past decade, really helps us to be confident to trumpet 14,1991 and the adaptation pathway standard as best practice. Not just us, but other infrastructure operators, particularly those who report under the adaptation reporting power. There is a consensus amongst everyone that those standards really do represent the way to embed adaptation into management systems, to secure the necessary top management, governance and resourcing to actually enable the adaptation journey, and then to enable the planning and monitoring to make sure it actually happens. So yeah, we're continually looking internally at the Environment Agency systems to continually improve, and would encourage others, whether they're regulated or not, to do the same and take a look at the standards.
Okay. That's great. Thanks, Mike. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to that, Spence? Or
I think just to add on, obviously our work is very extensive, and we do a lot of liaison with local authorities, both via a national structure and team, but also importantly locally. And good adaptation is all about, you know, understanding the local challenges and the local application in a particular area. So we are working via our local authority kind of liaison aspect of our work to, you know, promote the concept. But I think it's fair to say clearly at the moment we're focused on those that we regulate. The one other thing I would just point to is the good practice guidance that I mentioned earlier. That's freely available, and we can make it available, I'm sure, via this podcast. That is there as a template guidance document for, frankly, anybody, you know, that may wish to pick it up and then finesse, finalize, and make it relevant for their own particular audiences. So we can certainly help by you know, distributing that via this network after today's event.
that would be great. Thanks very much, Spence. I mean, the more we can raise awareness of these practical steps towards helping meet this challenge, the better. So yeah, we'd be delighted to help with that. Just turning to a couple of questions from participants in the audience. One very specific one that I'll just read out verbatim because it's quite specific is so local authorities also need to complete a risk assessment by April 24 as per the regulated sites. Is that correct? I think somebody's asking for some advice there.
Yeah, it's yet to be fully clarified. We are working with the local authorities, but without getting into too much detail, there are some complexities around how the permits via local authorities are structured. So we're working with colleagues we have a national local authority unit which supports all of the local authorities across England, and they're just working through some complexities. So I think the jury's out whether that same date of April next year will apply for local authorities. Clearly, the closer we get towards the end of the year, then I suspect a separate conversation needs to happen around what would be a sensible date for the local authority regulated sites.
Okay.
Yeah, I think just to be clear on that, it's not the local authorities themselves under the permitting regimes that would carry out the risk assessment. That's talking about regulated facilities that are regulated by local authorities. Having said that, under the Climate Change Act, adaptation reporting power, DEFRA signalled in its position and strategy for the fourth round of reporting that they will be exploring local authorities being invited to report. And there is a pilot being set up to explore what that might entail for local authorities reporting under the adaptation reporting power of the Climate Change Act. So again, watch this space. I think the the fourth round of adaptation reporting power guidance is due to be published by DEFRA imminently. And there might be more on that in terms of local authority reporting and indeed the wider set of infrastructure reporters.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, a lot of real sort of detail there. Was very important detail, to get these responsibilities fully understood and correct. So another question from one of the audience, and first of all, a comment. Thanks for the presentation. Really interesting. So that's good. That's good to know. So well done. I certainly found it very interesting. You mentioned that the Environment Agency regulates 12,000 sites. This person would like to find out which operators' sites are in scope, and so they're asking what's the best way to go about finding this out.
That's probably one for me, I think. Thanks, Tim. In essence, if the permits have the requirement for a management system, which is the main kind of plank that we've had as a theme throughout our permitting approaches for a number of years now. If your permit has the requirement for you to have a suitable management system to really demonstrate your capability and capacity to obtain and maintain permit compliance, then this requirement will apply to you. And it's as simple as that. So if your permit doesn't have a requirement for a management system, then it doesn't apply.
Okay.
But it will apply to the vast majority of permitted activities that the Environment Agency regulates.
And I guess one sort of follow-on question from that, Spence, is really how that's a lot of sites. 12,000 sites is an enormous amount of sites. How, given the pressure on resources, how is this sort of followed through by the Environment Agency in terms of firstly providing one-to-one support to those sites where required, and then also encouraging and ensuring the sort of take up of and compliance with the requirement? How does that work, and how effective is that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we're working on it, I suppose, is the short answer.
Mm-hmm.
It will be helped enormously by the questionnaire responses. I mentioned earlier we've got a voluntary questionnaire out with operators that are permitted at the moment. That intelligence that's coming back will really help us kind of drill down at a sector level. So perhaps looking at the chemical sector or combustion sector or energy from waste, whichever separate industrial sector it is, and across the waste sectors as well. We can then review those responses both nationally and importantly at an area level, so geographically as well, and really start to work up our own sort of interventions and support package over the coming years. We recognise we're on a journey, kind of said as much, hopefully, and everyone's probably at a differing starting point. And the questionnaire responses, from what I'm seeing, it's a good response rate to date. Bearing in mind it's voluntary and everybody is busy and up against it. But from what I'm seeing is that really will give us the insight at an individual sector level to kind of tailor a support package for the coming years. And it might be that we invoke on a targeted audit program, for example. We kind of put the messages out, work with the trade bodies, and kind of work together to produce a package of audits that really help kind of raise the profile for those that are regulated, help them escalate the issue up the management chain as well, which is often a common blocker. Here, it might be that those responses tell us, do you know what? Actually, this particular sector has kind of been grappling with this for some time, and they're telling us they're pretty confident that they're on top of the risks to and from their business through climate change. So it's going to be tailored, but largely built on the responses that we're getting on the questionnaire, and then kind of early interactions, I think, as we start to get boots on the ground next year, and as part of day-to-day interactions with the regulated community, we will get a better picture, I think, and be able to sort of further tailor the support that's going to be needed over the coming years.
And I think also, if you take it back to thinking about the standard 14,090. Early on in the standard, it talks about the concept of adaptive capacity. So the ability of the organisation to respond to climate change, to adapt. And we, the EA, have realised that we need to build our own adaptive capacity. We've got the top level commitment, top management commitment, but there's an awful lot of capability building that we've required to do. So alongside Scottish Environmental Protection Agency and with the support from consultants, Climate Sense, we have developed a specific regulatory officer training package to build the knowledge of the standards, climate impacts, and our expectations of industry. And then more broadly, we're developing an all-staff training package so that each and every member of the Environment Agency is brought up to a minimum level of understanding on climate impacts and adaptation thinking. So yeah, that building adaptive capacity is really important.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Just staying with you, Mike. You walked through quite a lot of potential weather extremes as induced by climate change, and what we might, if you like, look forward to in the future. And one of the things that I'm interested to know whether you've explored in any great detail is the possibility and the impact of compound events. So one event followed very closely by another event. So sort of classic scenario might be after an intense summer heat wave and a drought, we've got really hard baked soil surface, which effectively has become like concrete. And then we get an enormous summer downpour where we get, a month's worth or 2 months worth of rain in a few hours through an extreme rainfall event, leading to flash flooding of sites. Do you consider that within your thinking and your communication?
Yes, absolutely, we do. And that scenario you mentioned, heavy rain on dry ground, is one of the scenarios in the narrative of the climate impacts tool. Summer flooding can occur during drought. But on an industrial side, we saw that with CSG Sandhurst. A storm moved through a waste site, caused a fire. And then that same storm with heavy rain in Wales, a few days later, the floodwaters arrived at the site and flooded the site, which had just burnt down. So an unholy mess of a site after a fire was suddenly flooded.
Yes.
And that was even worse, impacting responders, carrying debris and all sorts off site. So in process industry risk assessment terms, double jeopardy, or it couldn't have lightning and flood, is sometimes used to defend the unforeseeable. No, we couldn't have foreseen that, when in practice climate systems are very much linked, and it can be incredibly foreseeable that you will see lightning and flood and strong winds. It's called a storm. So yes, you need to consider the full systemic cascading impacts and not discount them as acts of God.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. I got time for one last question, which sort of needs a quick response, but I'm suspicious it might not have it. But let's try and make it work. So, and this is sort of broadening it out to an international perspective. So clearly, your work has application outside the UK. You've based a lot of what you've done on an ISO standard, and I'm sure a lot of other jurisdictions could find what you're doing very, very interesting. Beyond the devolved administrations in the UK, we could think that maybe people in Canada and Australia and other places might be interested in what you've done. So, how are you actively engaged in working with sister organizations around the world to promote what you've done? And then secondly, and this kind of speaks to trade really, are are the adaptation regulations mirrored in other trading blocks, so as to avoid short-term competition distortions in trade? Now, we've got a couple of minutes, so a very short, sharp answer to that would be appreciated, but I think it's an important point.
So yes, in terms of international connections, we have got many links, direct links with individual regulators, for example, links into the Commission, European Commission, and just via something like LinkedIn, you can maintain the momentum of international improvement and attendance at global conferences. So yeah, and absolutely, but again, we can't do it alone, and institutions like IMechE and the global presence of IMechE certainly help to disseminate globally best practices. Spence, do you want to take
just to add, yeah, absolutely, I hear what you say, Tim, and we are very keen to engage with others. We attended an event in Ireland earlier this year, which was basically bringing together adaptation practitioners. So it was an opportunity for us to tell our story as to what we're requiring here. We work with other regulators under the IMechE program. We work with the OECD, for example. So we do reach out and engage with others to promote the approach, but also sharing best practice. We're sharing and hearing what others are doing in this space. So you could look at it and say, well, it looks like we're going it alone. The short answer is no, we're not. We're building our approach based on intelligence and information that we gathered from that ongoing kind of engagement on a international stage.
Okay. Well, look, thanks for that. We haven't really got time to delve into the trade playing field, I'm afraid, but very good question, maybe for another webinar event. But okay, so just remains for me to thank both Mike and Spence for really fascinating, interesting, and stimulating, and very useful from a practitioner's point of view presentation. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for attending, and also for putting up with our slight technical hitch about halfway through, where we lost the presentation slides. Apologies for that from the institution. If you'd like to review any parts of the webinar, including the bit where we dropped the slides, then maybe you want to listen to it again because you were too busy worrying about the slides having disappeared. You might want to listen to what was said again. But if you do, or you want to share the webinar with colleagues or contacts, it will be available in the webinar hub on the institution's website in the very near future. So yeah, thank you for attending, and goodbye from the Institution of Mechanical Engineers.